protecting those cities if it means that we'd have to ourselves have to have nuclear weapons. It tells you something about his orientation. The reality is that Pierre Trudeau undermined our alliances and pointlessly annoyed our major trading partners. Desperately tried to get us out of NATO, for example. Desperately tried to gut the Canadian military. As Derek Birdie, former Canadian ambassador to the United States, reminds us, Pierre Trudeau was a consummate actor. He got attention on the world stage, but very few results. It's kind of like one half of Rob Ford. At least Rob Ford's got some results, let alone the attention. Pierre Trudeau got the attention and no results. Alan Gottlieb, diplomat, another Canadian ambassador to the United States, a career public servant, said that Pierre Trudeau's foreign policy was a matter of Pierre Trudeau's personal will and whim. Mitchell Sharp, who was foreign minister under Pierre Trudeau, wrote that Trudeau's grandstanding on the world stage was driven more about the image of the Prime Minister than about what was in the best interests of Canada. This is Pierre Trudeau's foreign minister. He wanted us out of NATO. He was for unilateral disarmament. But when he wanted something from the Americans or from our allies, he was largely ignored. Whether it was going to the States and asking for an acid rain treaty, what did they do? They labeled all Canadian material of acid rain as propaganda. When Brian Mulroney went for an acid rain treaty, he got something because he had developed good relationships with the Americans. But Pierre Trudeau took great pleasure of thumbing his nose at the President of the United States of America. When he went on his famous World Peace Tour in Washington, they said his proposals were taken with the same seriousness as if they had come from Boys Nation, which is a local high school group. He was the darling of third world dictators and despots. Tell me, what other leader of a G7 country, an OECD nation, a member of NATO, what other country would have invited a communist thug, a dictator, to be the pallbearer for a Canadian Prime Minister? Which is what happened when Pierre Trudeau died. He was an honorary pallbearer. Fidel Castro was an honorary pallbearer for Pierre Trudeau. But of course, Fidel was returning the favor. Trudeau once remarked, you know, when you see the adoration that Fidel Castro receives, you wonder, what's the need for elections? This is what he said as Prime Minister of Canada. What's the need for elections? Showing his affinity with Cuba. When Pierre Trudeau died in Cuba, they flew their flags at half-mast. They declared 3 days of official mourning, as they would had a native son died. Of course, Trudeau was a mentor to Fidel Castro. And it was Trudeau who, as our Prime Minister, went to that imprisoned island and said to the Cuban people, many of whom I think were thirsting for freedom and liberty, long live Prime Minister and Commander-in-Chief Fidel Castro, adding, how much easier it would be to govern the Cuban way. This is our Canadian Prime Minister. You know, of course, Trudeau once famously paddled in a canoe to go to Cuba. Got halfway across. This was in the early 1960s. Not thinking later on about how many people were trying to escape in rickety boats from Cuba, trying to search for their freedom, and there he is trying to get there to join up with his revolutionaries.
Too bad he failed to succeed.
Trudeau cozied up to the Soviets, telling them that Canada, this is as Prime Minister, in 1971, going to the Soviet Union, saying that Canada was under military threat from the United States of America. Cultural and military threat. We hadn't had those threats since the War of 1812. He excused the Soviets when they shot down a Korean passenger plane, calling it a mere accident. And then adding, you know, at this stage, this is after the Soviets had shot down the Korean airliner. At this stage, we won't get more from the Soviet Union by treating them as murderers. We might get some de-escalation of the Cold War by treating them as human beings. He advised the Soviets to disregard Ronald Reagan and wait for his successor. Can you imagine, Canadian Prime Minister giving the Soviets advice to say, forget about Ronald Reagan, you know, he's just a grade B actor, wait for his successor. Of course, you know what happened there. The reality was that Pierre Trudeau was almost always, on the wrong side of history. From his parading around Quebec in a German military uniform, wearing a German helmet on his motorcycle during World War II, protesting conscription, right up to when Lech Walesa was leading the forces of liberty in Poland. Trudeau stood in the House of Commons to say, well, if martial law is a way to avoid civil war and Soviet intervention, then all I can say is not all bad. How do you think the forces of freedom and liberty in Poland took that particular statement? When Gorbachev was leading reforms of the Soviet Union, Trudeau lamented the development, remember of glasnost and perestroika? And he warned us. He warned us. He said the breakup of the Soviet Union is chaos, and it's something which I think we will eventually regret. This is your Prime Minister of Canada. Now, what did Margaret Thatcher think of Pierre Trudeau? This, I can say, is best exemplified by an encounter that happened in 1995 at the funeral of Soviet leader Konstantin Chernenko. At this point, Brian Mulroney was Prime Minister of Canada, and they were there for the funeral, but in a small room, preparing for the meeting. And so there was a few officials with Margaret Thatcher and a few officials with Brian Mulroney. And Sir Geoffrey Howe, who was foreign minister, asked Brian Mulroney a question. He said, Mr. Mulroney, you know, what's happened now with your Mr. Trudeau? And Brian Mulroney said, well, he said, I should have you know that he's about to get international recognition. He's about to get some great big international prize. Margaret Thatcher, her head was down and was working on her papers, lifted her head and said, must be the Lenin Prize. Let's talk about national unity. This, of course, Pierre Trudeau's quote, is, today at long last, Canada is acquiring full and complete national sovereignty. This was the passage of the Constitution Act and the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, as if he created and established individual rights for Canada, as if the Magna Carta, the Bill of Rights, Petition of Rights, or even John Deaconbaker's rights, or the Magna, all of the court precedents didn't exist. That Pierre Trudeau is the architect of rights in Canada. But the highest duty of any Prime Minister, I think, is national unity. It was the cause of Sir John A. Macdonald. It was the cause of Laurier, Mackenzie King, even Lester B. Pearson before Trudeau. Trudeau's first major mark on the nation, in terms of nation building, was the October crisis. Now, I can tell you, having spent 3 years researching Pierre Trudeau, when I came to this topic, I fully expected to heap nothing but praise on Pierre Trudeau for his handling of that moment of crisis and how determined he was, how right he was, and how decisive he was for the country. What I discovered in my research shocked me. The invocation of the War Measures Act was not, as Trudeau suggested, a response to a provincial request or something sought by the City of Montreal. It wasn't sought by the RCMP, it wasn't sought by the Quebec Police. The request for the War Measures Act was drafted by Trudeau's Principal Secretary, Marc Lalonde. And it is exactly what Pierre Trudeau had in mind, the War Measures Act, when he said, just watch me. So, what did we have with the War Measures Act? We had the suspension of civil liberties in Canada. We gave the police the right to arrest people without a warrant, able to search homes without a warrant, able to withhold people in prison without charge for an indefinite period of time. We had the censorship of our press. We had the army in the streets. Any number of measures. Nothing that you saw after September 11th in the United States when they were under attack. So what was this? What was the evidence that our country, the future of our country was at stake? That we were about to lose our democracy? Why did we need the piece of legislation that had been passed at the outset of World War I when Canada was at war after Great Britain had declared war? Yes, we heard about rumors. We heard about rumors about 3,000 armed revolutionaries. We heard about there being enough dynamite in the hands of terrorists to blow up the island of Montreal. These were rumors. But what did we hear from the Prime Minister? What did we hear from the Minister of Justice? We were told, well, if you knew what we knew, you would understand why we need these very serious measures. You knew what we knew. Of course, when your Prime Minister says that, that has quite a significance. The truth, ladies and gentlemen, was there was no evidence of a massive conspiracy. When Pierre Trudeau, in the height of the crisis, tried to convince Peter C. Newman what was behind it all, Newman, when he asked for the evidence, Newman concluded that what he had been told by Trudeau and what Trudeau told the country was a meticulously concocted lie. Trudeau responded to Newman, Peter C. Newman, by saying, well, my proof here was I acted on information I had been accumulating since I was 3 years old. We've got to show the democratically elected governments that they are the governments. In fact, if anyone was inciting fear in the population as a whole, that their liberty was at risk, it was Trudeau himself. In invoking the War Measures Act, he said to the country, he said the kidnappers' purposes would be served equally well by having in their grip you, or me, or perhaps some child. Tell me that, and I'm going to say, yes, Prime Minister, what powers do you need to protect our children? James Cross had it right when he was asked about his assessment. James Cross was the British diplomat who had been captured and was released on December the 11th. The anniversary is coming up. He said, in his view, it was 6 kids trying to make a revolution. Trudeau misled us because he wanted to use the War Measures Act as a political tool to crush the forces of separatism. Do we need the War Measures Act as a political tool? We have democracy for that. As a consequence of invoking the War Measures Act, 500 people were arrested and thrown in jail. 10,000 homes were searched without a warrant. Take the case of Nick Offermeyer. You remember Nick? He was a Montreal bon vivant, CBC journalist, writer, interesting man about town, hung out on Crescent Street, but of course he got nabbed in the process under the War Measures Act. But when they came to Nick Offermeyer's apartment, he wasn't there. He had moved. But there were 5 Vietnamese students who were studying at McGill University who had moved into his apartment. And what happened? The police arrested them and threw them into jail. What does it say about Canada when we can take 5 innocent students and throw them into jail without charge, without any reasonable grounds whatsoever? What did that say about us?